So when I got asked to chair this panel, I was asked to give a brief introduction to Caribou knowledge, where we're at and where we're going to from here, in a method and attempt to be provocative, I guess, and get you all fired up so that you ask the rest of the panel members lots of questions and not me. So hopefully it'll work out that way. And I've been freezing all morning, so I think it's time we heat up the conversation. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about where we're at a point in time and knowledge needs to go forward. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on what we already know. I think that's been fairly well covered, and you heard something about what's being learned right now in the rest of the presentations today. I thought it was very informative. So we've got the new recovery strategy hot off the press. It has a target of 65% undisturbed. Roughly, that's got to be 40 years old and not fragmented by footprint. It can move around in space and time, but the federal government is expecting progress to be shown in action plans. And it also includes provisions for predator and primary prey management, and the feds very generously gave the provinces and territories 3 to 5 years to come up with these things. Nice job of offloading, feds. However, Alberta is all prepared. Have this woodland policy at Caribou came out in June 2011. Says much the same things that are in the federal strategy. We're going to work together. We're going to figure out these action plans at the Caribou range level. So that sets the scenes. But clearly we have to do this together. We're not going to be able to individually as sectors, as companies, tackle this. It's an ILM issue. Everybody has to be involved. And that leads us to the first question in the knowledge framework. How are we going to do that? We've got all kinds of good intentions, but we don't really have good policy and planning instruments that allow us to do these kinds of things, although there are some encouraging examples already on the ground in Alberta, and I'll mention 1 or 2 of those. So I'm really going to focus on the habitat and footprint sides because I think that's what primarily interests most of the folks in the room here. It's on the industry side. But the habitat and footprint is managed, and it's more on government side where populations and human use is managed. So what can industry do? Well, we can manage early cereal. We can plan for this 65% undisturbed over 40 years old. We can look to manage in large patches, which seems to address the fragmentation issues. And just an example, here's the Little Smoky range again. This data is about 5 years old. I didn't have some updated stuff, and it talks about 0 and 30 years as one age class. I didn't have time to reclassify to 40. But you can see that in terms of age class, the Little Smoky is really not that bad a shape. And if you draw some red lines around where the harvesting has occurred till now, you can see that there's still large areas that are, as far as age goes, in pretty good shape in the Little Smoky. As far as footprint goes, everybody knows the oft-repeated saying that it's the most dense seismic line density in the province, and as far as footprint goes, it's already sewered. Now let's look at the animal distribution. Here's some caribou GPS color points, and you can see where the caribou are, and you can see that it isn't necessarily always in the undisturbed in terms of age class. They're overlapping with some of the harvesting areas. So if you take and let the animals vote with their feet and draw a line around where most of the animals are, there's significant overlap with that older forest, but there's also some overlap with areas that have already been converted to early cereal. So this might be the basis for that 65% target in an area like the Little Smoky. And that might be the situation where everybody says, well, this will be the stuff that will manage to recreate that 65%, which means we have to manage to get rid of the footprint over time and to recover the age class in areas that aren't already there. So that's the way to think about this. I think it's disturbance and recovery. What do we got to do today to have what we want in the future? So we can do that. We already know here's 50 years after fire in the foothills. Here's another 50 years after clear cutting in the foothills. Over time, habitat does recover. But what can we do, or what can we recognize that's already out there that might help us along the way? So in certain site types, we're not going to produce early cereal food for primary prey. We're going to produce lichens for caribou. And that can happen actually quite quickly after disturbance. We can also do things like thin stands to promote lichen production over early cereal food for primary prey. Okay, switching to footprint, what are the issues here? Well, we are going to continue developing footprint out there, so the way to do that is to reduce the future footprint by coordinated planning, for example. Take a life cycle approach to footprint, reactivate or deactivate footprint that we're not using, and reclaim it when we're done. And then, of course, the mitigation that has to occur because it's going to take a long time for this footprint to go away. So an example of what's going on in the Berlin-Smoky Regional Access Plan, this was developed by the FLMF and the Alberta government. Here's the FLMF members right now, many of the companies represented here in the room. And the first thing we did is we sat down and looked at the areas where there weren't roads yet and figured out some logical corridors to use that when the road gets developed by whichever sector, it'll be able to be used by the other sector. So that was actually a significant task, took a couple of years. The next task is what about the stuff that's already out there? What are we going to do about that? Oh, I should mention that it doesn't mention these tertiary and temporary roads yet. So those also have to be considered. And the way to look at the stuff that's already out there is to take a life cycle approach, deactivate when you're not using it, reclaim it when it's done. We've got a lot of roads out there that probably already can qualify for one or the other of these categories. And just to get an idea of what it's like, is an active road is probably going to be in use by humans for one reason or another, more or less indefinitely. But we get lots of roads that we build them and we use them for a period of time and then we don't use them for a long time. And those roads could be deactivated for a period of time until we need them again, and then you just pop them up and reclaim them or reactivate them and use them again and then deactivate them. So a lot of roads can be in that active to deactivated state back and forth in time. They're going to be needed for longer term use, but not every day. And finally, once that road is done or footprint is done, it can be reclaimed and we can get it back on a recovery trajectory. So the special case of seismic lines, here's the little Smoky again. This is just a representation of the seismic lines. If I put them all on there, the map would be black. There's lots of them out there. A few years ago, FLMF and ESRD sponsored a project to look at these seismic lines and decided that we would call anything that had 2 meters tall and over 30% cover reclaimed. And this is just a pictorial representation of what that might look like. Did an inventory using 3D soft copy and came up with about 42% of the lines already meet that criteria, or they're just not quite tall enough yet and they'll be there soon. When you look at that at a finer scale, you start getting into questions about, okay, so some of these lines are reclaimed according to our definition, but it's like a pick up sticks approach to landscape management. It's just some of them. They're all over the place. So then that leads to the question of what is reclamation from a caribou recovery perspective, from a functional perspective. So what are these things about these seismic lines that we hope we can manage on a recovery trajectory over time? In other words, when does footprint go away? I don't mean to pick on the folks from Environment Canada, but when the boreal recovery strategy consultations were ongoing, I asked somebody from BC, when would the feds consider the footprint to be gone? And the answer I got back was when they couldn't see it on the satellite image anymore. Don't think that works from a caribou perspective, so here's an area we need to investigate. Here's an older one. Is this one gone? I don't know. It doesn't seem to have much primary prey food, no game trails on it. Maybe that one is gone. Maybe that one is recovered. Another engine that we need to recognize here is the forest industry is in the business of harvesting and recovery after disturbance. And when we come to a cut block that has a seismic line or some other footprint that isn't needed anymore going through it, we reclaim it and reforest it along with the cut block. So that's another eraser of seismic lines, and over time will affect large chunks of the landscape. Mitigation practices. We do a lot of these mitigation practices now, arguably not enough for caribou because caribou are still in trouble. We need to look at these with a jaundiced eye and stop doing things that cost a lot of money that aren't giving us any value, and look for ones that are giving us high value necessarily, hopefully at low cost, but if there's a high value, high cost ones, we should look at those as well. Here's some examples. What do we do to get rid of this primary food, prey food basket that we're developing out there? This is good for deer and elk. It's also pretty good for bears, as we saw in an earlier presentation. What about things like pipelines and other footprints? We typically put them in and then let them go, and this one naturally has reforested. Can that be accelerated and assisted? We heard a talk earlier about that as well. What about practices such as penning? Can that help with mitigation, and how effective is it? And there was an experiment at the Little Smoky and another one being talked about in northeastern Alberta today. On the population side, I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but some questions such as how can predation on caribou reduced? Can primary prey management benefit caribou? Can we get at it without having to manage the predators directly? How can we manage human use where we feel that human use is an issue? And can we actually convert human use from being viewed as a problem into being viewed as part of the solution? So if we'd like to reduce primary prey, perhaps rather than excluding hunters and other people from caribou range, we should actually be encouraging them, because they're the ones that might remove those white-tailed deer that we're so concerned about. And then, of course, human use is not just non-industry, it's also industry itself. We heard some talks today about the effect of disturbance on critters and whether or not we can manage human use in space and time so that we mitigate that as well. So just in conclusion, we really have to look at evaluating solutions and then implementing them and seeing if they're working or not and making adjustments as we go through time. Industry can focus on habitat and footprint, and government has to look at populations and human use. We have to have action plans, we have to implement them, we have to monitor them, and we have to look at continual improvement. All of these areas have knowledge needs, and I guess I'm kind of excited that we're finally going to get some of these action plans and start putting them out and give us a whole new opportunity for research and evaluation.